I wonder if you think the world is more secure or less secure than it was a year ago. And I wonder whether you personally feel more secure or less secure than a year ago. I mean, over the last year, there's been the outworking of the presidential election. There's been the outworking of the Brexit vote, North Korea. Some of you guys know more than I do. There's the ongoing squeeze on public sector funding. Our world, even at Stoke railway station, where I was the other day, there were armed police, even at Stoke railway station. And of course, that's just the national and international scene. In our lives, we all know what it is to have worries and concerns, not so much about ourselves, but about people we love, whether it's health or money or relationships, and of course people who do not know Jesus. Sorry, I could really get us good and depressed if I wanted to this morning. But the world of Isaiah was surprisingly similar. Isaiah lived in Jerusalem. That's been in the news this week. Isaiah lived in Jerusalem. He started his career, if you can call it that, his career as a prophet in 740 BC. I'm always amazed how accurately the historical records can let us date these things. What was the position of God's people at that particular time? Well, frankly, it was a shambles, and it was about to get worse. Internationally, the superpower of that time was a country called Assyria. They were aggressive, they were predatorial, they were ruthless, they were out to conquer Israel and Judah. So internationally things were dire, and nationally both Israel and Judah had a succession of kings who had repeatedly chosen to rebel against God. If you were to flick through the book of 1 and 2 Kings, you will note there's one verse that comes again and again about the kings. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. And so what was life like for ordinary people like you and me at that time? Well, there was injustice, and there was deprivation, and there was oppression. To quote God himself in Isaiah 3, he says to the country's leaders, "What do you mean by crushing my people and grinding the faces of the poor?" So it was into that pit of insecurity and uncertainty, it was into that pit that Isaiah brings these, I think these words are stupendous this morning. Isaiah brought those stupendous words of Isaiah chapter 11. You can see my title, which I don't think is over-egging the pudding. My title is Sing for Joy, People of God. And my 3 headings: we are longing for our perfect King to come. We are longing for his perfect kingdom to come. We are God's rescued people. So, we're longing for our perfect King to come. Chapter 11, verse 1, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. I looked at that and I thought, what on earth does that mean? 2 words that I think will just unlock that verse for us, and those 2 words are family tree. That's what's going on here. These are the language of the family tree. Lots of people these days, don't they? They spend hours researching their ancestry online and that sort of thing, and they ring up vicars and say, my Uncle Albert was buried in your churchyard 1,000 years ago. Did you know him? That sort of thing. This is family tree language in verse 1. Jesse, who was Jesse? Jesse was the father of King David. Up until that point in time, the greatest king Israel had ever had. But that was many years ago, many years before the time of Isaiah. And since then, the country had gone down and down and down. Because, as we've already noted, the quality of the kings in terms of their godliness had gone down and down and down. And so Israel, not the house of Windsor, the house of David, the house of Jesse, was not now a flourishing tree. It was a stump. It was a dead stump. The tree had been toppled. There was anarchy within the country. There was attack from outside the country. David had a king. David had a son called Solomon. His reign started quite well, but then he went the way of many leaders. Money, sex, and power seduced him, and his reign ended very badly. And following his death, there was a power grab. This is all familiar stuff, isn't it? You know, we see it today. There was a power grab, and then there was not quite civil war, but almost civil war, and his country was ripped in two. So not Catalonia, Spain. This was Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Two countries. Israel in the north, 722 BC, during Isaiah's life. Israel, country in the north, was invaded by the Assyrians and completely swallowed up. And Judah was next on their hit list. But a new king was to come. So Isaiah's message, our world is a disaster at the moment, but there is a green shoot coming up in the family tree. A king will come. We are longing for our king to come, said Isaiah. What will this king be like? Look what Isaiah tells us. Verse 2, the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. Gosh, what a king. I do want to tread slightly carefully here, because I profoundly think it is unhelpful for us as Christians to join in the media's game of knocking and ridiculing and trashing politicians and presidents. As far as I can see, a great many of our politicians genuinely do their best to serve us well. And I think the very best politicians recognise that all human beings, including them, are very imperfect and flawed. So I really don't want to play the let's knock politicians and presidents game and ridicule people. But I do think it legitimate to make a contrast and to ask ourselves, what would it be like? What would it really be like if our leaders, if our presidents were like verses 2 and 3? What would it be like if our world was ruled by those who were utterly wise and had complete understanding? Verse 2. If those who exercise counsel and might, and I think that's talking about military strength and military strategy, what would it be like if those who rule over us, verse 2, do it with perfect knowledge, because they have God's knowledge and God's indwelling spirit? Verse 3, what would it be like if our world were ruled by people who had a fear of the Lord, a deep and profound awe of him? And going into verse sort of 3 and into verse 4, what if those rulers were not only able to set good laws and policies, but they were able to administer justice and social care wisely and effectively? What would it be like? It'd be a different world, wouldn't it? It would be a different world. It would be good and secure and just and safe. This king that God promised through Isaiah, verse 5 sums him up. Righteousness will be his belt and faithfulness the sash around his waist. Just like Meg, my niece, she's training to be a nurse. We saw her a couple of weeks ago. She's down in Plymouth. She showed us her uniform. She moaned about the very sensible clerk's shoes. I said, well, they look great to me, which of course damned them even more in her eyes. Her uniform will identify who she is. Her uniform identifies what she does, what she stands for. The clothing of this king, a belt of righteousness. He will do what is 100% right and 100% appropriate 100% of the time. The sash of faithfulness. He will deliver on 100% of his promises to 100% of his people. More soberly, he will also deliver on 100% of his promises to those who are set on opposing him. Verse 4, but with righteousness he will judge the needy, with justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. I'm still haunted by the story I heard from one of my friends who's a vicar in one of the London churches. He has someone in his congregation who's from North Korea. I've got no idea how they got out. He tells me horrendous stories. In that country, it is not unknown for Christians to be laid out in the road by the authorities in front of their families and road rollers driven over them. This promised king will slay those who refuse to repent of their wickedness, and how right that is. How we're longing for this perfect king to come. But secondly, we're longing for his perfect kingdom to come. And what's this perfect kingdom going to look like? Isaiah tells us, verse 6, the wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear, their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The infant will play near the cobra's den, and the young child will put its hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the water covers the sea. This is the world we would love to live in, isn't it? This is paradise. I know you've spotted this already. The Bible starts with paradise and the Bible ends with paradise. Genesis 2, the Garden of Eden, paradise. God, the gardener, placing his people in the garden paradise to rule as his under-gardeners. There to tend and nurture and rule over creation under his authority. Enjoying, I love this verse, enjoying walking with him in the cool of the day. And the Bible ends, Revelation 22, do look at it later, it ends, very last chapter of the Bible, and there's a garden. Eden is restored, paradise is restored. And I'm sure you spotted this as well. The beginning of the Bible, the end of the Bible, there is paradise. And in the centre of the Bible, the very centre of world history, the Lord Jesus Christ says to that dying thief on the cross, that dying thief who repents, he says to him, today you will be with me in paradise. The perfect king will bring in the perfect kingdom by reversing the disastrous consequences of Genesis 3. Verse 6, the wolf will live with the lamb. Even in the animal world there will be harmony. How much more in the human world? Verse 8, the infant will play near the cobra's den. I don't have a cobra, but I do have a dog. My dog is the softest dog in the world, but would I leave my dog alone with a newborn baby? No, I wouldn't, because there's always that tiny risk. But in this new kingdom, there will be no more danger from anything anymore to anyone. End of verse 8, the young child will put their hand in the viper's nest. In the context of Eden, we cannot but remember who the viper, who the snake stands for. Satan's power has gone. Actually, Satan will be gone. Who will be there to tempt me in this new kingdom? Well, no one will be there to tempt me because the tempter's poison has gone. Verse 9. I think you can summarize verse 9 with 3 words or 4 words, or no, 5 words here. Peace, holiness, knowing the Lord. Verse 9, they will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. This is the message of Isaiah. This actually is the message of the whole of the Bible. A perfect king is going to bring in a perfect kingdom. We're longing for our perfect king to come. We are longing for his perfect kingdom to come. Sorry, I haven't said who this king is. Who is this king? He is Christ. Christ is the Greek word for king. He is Christ Jesus. Verse 1, he will come from the family tree of Jesse, father of David. One of those little things, where was King David born? Once in royal David's city. David was born in the little town of Bethlehem, just as his promised descendant would. Okay, here's the but. And this is a big but. For many of us, this is a very big but indeed. Okay, if the child in Bethlehem is indeed this person, rather than a sort of cutesy made-up story, if Jesus is indeed the king of verses 1 to 6, then why, if he came 2,000 years ago, why are we not yet currently experiencing the kingdom of verses 6 to 10 today? Do you see the question? The world in the time of Isaiah was horrible. It was ungodly, it was insecure, with just tiny patches of godliness and justice and security. And our problem today is surely that even though that claim did come true, it is claimed 750 years later, a promised man came, surely our problem is we still live in Isaiah's world, don't we? Today is still a world that is ungodly and insecure. It's still a world with only tiny patches, as far as I can see, of godliness and security. Today is still a world of danger and of despair and death. And things have changed a bit, but not much. Things have changed a bit in the sense that, no, it's not Assyria with their horses and swords and chariots. No, today we've got North Korea, we've got Islamic State. This week we've got violence on the streets of Jerusalem. So are we not tempted to say, and if we're not tempted to say this, I'm tempted to say, well, why aren't we tempted to say this? Aren't we tempted to say, well, this promised king hasn't delivered? We've still got people living on our streets. We've still got people in poverty. We've still got people of all ages getting very sick. And people of all ages dying. And we've still got a world full of people like us, with our imperfect thoughts and motives and words and actions. This very week, to quote the old prayer book prayer, I have followed too much the devices and desires of my own heart. I have left undone those things which I ought to have done. I have done those things which I ought not to have done. Given all of this, are we not tempted to say that the promised king hasn't delivered? And of course the problem with thinking he hasn't delivered is if I think, well, he hasn't delivered, then that's going to tempt me to stop putting my faith in him if he's a king that doesn't deliver. And this is a real issue, isn't it? Because I bet this morning, I'm not going to do this, but I bet if I got a flip chart out, we could make quite a list of people who either as children or adults were once in our church, who aren't with us any longer, because they have concluded that Christianity doesn't work. Jesus doesn't deliver. It doesn't do what they thought it would. Jesus hasn't delivered. That's what people do. But there is an answer to all of this. And of course the answer is to realize that the prophecy of Isaiah is going to be fulfilled not in one coming, but in two comings. We read earlier, we tend to read this most Sundays in Advent, out Isaiah 9, we read as we lit those candles, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and we say, yes, that was fulfilled in Bethlehem, we can see that. That was fulfilled at his first coming. Isaiah 53, which we haven't looked at this morning, but the words will be very familiar to us. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. Now that was fulfilled by Jesus on the cross. That was fulfilled at his first coming. But it is at his second coming, and we don't know when that will be. It's at his second coming, at the end of this present age, we will see the new heaven and the new earth, and we will see the perfect King face to face in his perfect kingdom. It is then that we will see verse 6 onwards. We're looking forward to our perfect King coming. Yes, he has come, and that's why we make a bit of a big deal about Christmas. But how we are longing for our perfect King to come a second time. Because we are longing for his perfect kingdom to come in all its completeness. So finally, and much more briefly, we are the King's rescued people. Verse 10, in that day, the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for his peoples. The nations will rally to him, and his resting place will be glorious. Those of us who have made Jesus our King, one day we will be with him, and it will be, to quote Isaiah, it will be glorious. Now the question is, and I've really struggled with this, the wardens know I've struggled with this, because I don't even ask them. Quite often we look at, when we are wardens meetings, we might look at the passage we're preaching on the following week. And I really struggled, and I said to them, well, so what? Why is Isaiah saying all of this to us? What does he want us to do with this information? And then I discovered chapter 12. And chapter 12, I think, just gives us the answer. Why is Isaiah saying all of this to us? Chapter 12, Isaiah is saying all of this to us so that we can be joyful now about the joy that is to come. Look at this song Isaiah encourages the people of his day to sing in anticipation of the joy that was to come. Chapter 12, I think there are three verses that are worth looking out for. The three verses are, I will praise, I will trust, I will not be afraid. I will praise you, Lord. Although you are angry with me, your anger has turned away and you have comforted me. Surely God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. The Lord himself is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. In that day you will say, give praise to the Lord, proclaim his name, make known among the nations what he has done, and proclaim that his name is exalted. Sing to the Lord, for he has done glorious things. Let this be known to all the world. Shout aloud and sing for joy, people of Zion, for great is the Holy One of Israel among you. I will praise, I will trust, I will not be afraid. People of God, Isaiah says, sing not just with your lips, sing with your lives, sing for joy. We are longing for our perfect King to come. We are longing for his perfect kingdom to come. We are the King's rescued people. I will praise, I will trust, I will not be afraid.